IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I am Pranay and today I have with me Sarthak, and today we are discussing a topic that both of us like a lot, which is public finance. So we are entering into the dangerous territory of taxes and subsidies and whatnot. But let's begin with a specific issue that happened recently. So the Supreme Court passed a recent judgment in a case called the Union of India versus Measures Mohit Minerals Private Limited. And in that, the bench ruled that the GST Council's decisions are not binding on the union government or on the state. So it said that whatever GST Council suggests is only recommendatory in nature. Now, that has led to a lot of discussions and opinions in the media. One set of arguments say that this has given more freedom to the state governments. The other argument says that, this might lead to logjams going ahead, because since the GST Council is no longer a decision of the GST Council is not binding, it might lead to cases where some states might chart a territory on their own and go away from this idea of one nation, one tax, which has its own benefits, etc. So that's what we are going to discuss about. Sarthak has read about it and I wanted to know more about it. So here we are. So Sarthak, let's begin first. What are the benefits of having something like a GST?
So before 2016, right, there were different kinds of taxes on indirect goods. The union, it used to impose certain taxes. The states used to impose different kinds of taxes. Now just think about it, how all these things would be impacting businesses, right? So businesses will now have to comply with multiple taxes, right? So union taxes, and then on top of that, different kinds of state taxes. So there was this cascading effect. On top of that, all the different states, right, they are using their own power to levy taxes. So which implies that some states might have a higher tax, some states will have lower tax. Think of it from the perspective of different businesses, right? They have to, again, think of all these things. They need to have people who are managing all these things. The compliance cost will be high. And also movement of goods from one place to another, right? There will be, again, massive transaction cost here. And also it led to other host of things, right? You will set up headquarters somewhere, some other branches somewhere to ensure that you don't have to pay enough taxes. So this also is part of the compliance cost. So to ensure or to minimize all these things, we are going ahead with what is called as the goods and service taxes, and we are trying to minimize all that compliance cost, the transaction cost. So the idea is there will be uniform taxation throughout the length and breadth of the country. That is what was the aim of GST.
Right, yeah. So that was one big benefit, right, where especially interstate movement of goods, there were multiple permissions, permit checkpoints, etc., which have all been eliminated.
Yeah.
So I guess that is one major benefit. And as you said, the compliance cost, if the GST comes to a structure where taxes are rationalized, the compliance cost will also probably go down compared to what they are. So all right, so that was there, and we had a new federal institution which was imagined part of to administer this GST, called the GST Council, right? And the GST Council was unique in the sense that it had equal representation from all states, unlike those other bodies which we have where it is based on population, right? And there were also some recommendations on the power between union and states, right? What was that structure like?
Yeah. So if you look at the GST Council, the composition is such that the states have like 66% of the votes, while the union has 33% of the votes. So it seems as if the states have more power, double the power as compared to the union. But keep in mind that again, the 66% is divided among host of states, multiple states, of states as well as union territories. And to get anything passed, right, you need 75% of the votes, right? So which indirectly means that states on their own, if all of them are together also, they cannot get things which they support, right? They have to get the support of the union government, which indirectly implies that union government has a veto. And if the union government wants to get something passed, right? So it did not need the support of all the states, right? 21 out of the 20 remaining states and union territories is enough to get things passed. So there is some form of power asymmetry in this particular body that was there.
All right.
So this has been the case, but if you look at the way GST Council has operated, in most of the cases you have had consensus. Right? It's not that, I mean, in recent times we have had different kinds of conflicts. Some of the state finance ministers, they have come out in the open and they have mentioned that, okay, things are not happening as expected. But at least in the initial years, things were fine. And most of the decisions have been on the basis of consensus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so interesting. So if all state governments come together and say that in the spirit of vertical redistribution, all the money collected from GST, 80% should go to the state governments and only 20% to the union government. That can't happen because of the structure, which, okay, I understand why that might be the case. All right, so this was a experiment, the GST Council. And were its decisions when it was founded, were they supposed to be binding on the union government or states?
Yeah, so this is something which is not explicitly mentioned, right? Whether it should be binding or not. But if you look at the constitution, right, it is the legislatures, right, who usually have the power to taxation. And again, we can not only India look at history world over, right? So it's the same thing. Legislatures have the power. So in case of India, it will be the parliament or the state legislative assemblies who should ideally have the power to tax.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a social contract, right?
Yeah, exactly.
With the state, like some two people can't decide what tax will be put, but it has to be approved by the representatives whom we choose. So that's the logic of it.
So that is the case, right? But here, what is happening is you have created a body which has representation of different state governments, and they are deciding it. So somewhere there is this variation, right? And this was not explicitly mentioned that, okay, the recommendations of this body should be binding on different union governments and the state government. It is not there, right? So there has been this kind of a conflict from the beginning, and some state, in fact, on top of this, another issue here is some state finance ministers have also pointed out that maybe it's certain union government ministries or officials, they are the ones who are deciding things. It's not necessarily the members who are going and who have an equal say over there. Again, this is something which is informal maybe, but if you look at the structure, no, it was not binding and it has not been explicitly mentioned anywhere. It's just that the Supreme Court made it explicit.
Yeah, so it does, in a sense, this case has now clarified things and made it sure that this was the case, that of course legislatures ultimately have the ultimate power to decide taxation, and GST Council's decisions are ultimately recommendatory in nature. And like you said, until now, most of the decisions have come through consensus, so which is fairly good thing to say. But over the last few years, Sarthak, there have been a lot of ill will which has developed between state governments and union governments, especially during the pandemic, when there was this compensatory cess related issue, and the union government said that there was also the issue of should we continue that compensatory cess after the initial period, etc. Right? So can you lay that out for us, that what were some of these main bones of contention in the GST Council?
Yeah. So the first thing is to get states on board with this, because again, this requires the states should also come on board, right? Because their taxation powers are getting changed now. So the states will be losing out their taxation powers. So how do you ensure that they come on the table for negotiation and finally they agree to that? Right. So for that, it was decided that the states will be compensated for the first 5 years. Right. So it was estimated that over a period of time, the state's revenue will also increase because of possibly increase in business activity, economic activity, business activity, increase in revenues through taxes. But for the time being, right, in the short term, maybe the states will be at the receiving end. So why will a state agree to this? Right. So the union government had promised, or that was the promise here, that we will compensate for what the loss of revenue, and it is expected that year on year there will be 14% increase in revenue. We will try to compensate for that if you are not getting enough revenue. So for the first few years, this compensation and all these things worked fine. But after that, things are changing, right? So the union government, especially during the time of the pandemic, right, its revenue forecast and other things were not as expected. And all these things led to different kinds of issues, right? So union government said that, okay, we will not be able to compensate maybe. Also, another way to look at it, during the pandemic, the state governments, right? So they also were not able to generate enough revenue because, again, collapse of business activity, economic activity. On top of that, they had to carry out all these activities to deal with the pandemic. So they are now increasing their spending. On top of that, they're not having enough revenue. So all these things have led to massive amount of clashes. And if you look at the data, so it was assumed that the state GST, it grew at around 6.7% for between 2018 to 2021. And whatever taxes were subsumed before GST, right? So those taxes, they used to grow at a higher rate, right? So 9.8% between 2014 to 2017. So those taxes the revenue from those taxes were increasing at a faster pace as compared to the revenue that the states are getting from GST. So that is again one, because effectively the states are becoming poorer, right? On top of that, if you look at how much SGST has grown, for 17 major states, it grew below 10%. Right? And for state like Uttarakhand, it was negative for the financial year 2019 to 2022. Right? So all these things are leading to issues because you do not have enough money. And when you don't have enough money and you expected that the revenues will be way higher, yeah, there will be that expectation and the reality, there is a mismatch here. Apart from that, there have been other issues pointed out, that there have been delays when it comes to payments. The meetings used to be more frequent in the past. GST Council meetings, they have become less frequent. And on top of that, some states, and again, if you look at data, it also points to the same thing. The amount of money in the divisible pool, right? So that has again not increased as expected. So the union government will collect different taxes, and from those taxes, a part goes to the union government and a part goes to the state government, right? That is, and the ratio and all these things are decided by the Finance Commission. Now,
so just to clarify, divisible pool is the total taxation collected minus collection costs and minus all the cesses and surcharges that the union government raises, right? That forms the divisible pool. That's the money which will be distributed between union and states and between all the states.
Yeah. So again, GST collections overall have increased, but the size of the divisible pool has not increased as much. Now, what is the reason? Because union government has again found out different ways to collect different taxes, right? Says the ratio of cesses and all have increased. So all this money, if it had been part of that divisible pool, the states would have benefited, but they are not getting the benefit here. So again, this has raised multiple apprehensions, and the smaller states are becoming more dependent. Now again, one of the reasons could be because they don't have enough ways by which they can diversify the sources from where they can get the revenue. So it makes them even more dependent on the union government now. And again, many of these things have been pointed by the Finance Commission also. 15th Finance Commission report talks about that revenues have been volatile, and the different forecasts that you had, original forecasts, there is a deviation from those original forecasts. So all these things have led to issues between the union and the states.
All right, so we'll continue this conversation, but we'll take a short break and get back to the future and how do we resolve this issue.
Hello. It's been another great week here on the IVM Podcasts Network. On Shunya 1, Sheeladitya asks Arham Pratap Jain, founder and chief trucking officer of Trucknetic, about his entrepreneurial journey. On Cyrus Says Cock and Bull, Cyrus, Ayushi, Sriram and Abbas, that's me, comment on how an American man quit his dream job at Netflix simply because he was bored. On Press Decode, Sara Vagda and Prafula discuss the controversy around former BJP spokesperson Nupur Sharma's hateful comments. On Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav discovers the bizarre connection between Jesus Christ and the deadly militant organization LTTE. And on Ek Chuski Finance, Priyanka teaches us the basics of asset allocation. We've got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcasts has just launched its merch, and our first line is out now. Head to the IVM Podcasts website and click on the shop tab to check out our first collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platforms you're listening on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. We're also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you respond to our shows and advertising on the network. We would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it in. It helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week. SBI Life Insurance, Apne Liye, Apno Ke Liye. Jupiter, a digital banking app. Capgemini, get the future you want. Intel vPro, built for business. And Intel, future banao wonderful with Intel powered laptops.
All right, we are back and we were discussing about the GST Council and the recent Supreme Court judgment around it. So Sarthak, before you go ahead, I just had a few points about this. I think that comparison between tax collections with the growth that you mentioned around 9% earlier and then with GST to 6%, they are across different timelines, right? Because those taxes were there before 2015 when GST came into being, and now we are talking about 2016, and our economy is growing much slower now. So I think that comparison from a policy analyst view does not make sense, because you were talking about the whole issue here is India's economy has slowed down. So any tax that you would have had, the growth of it would have been lesser because the economy is not growing as fast as it was growing, let's say, between 2003 to 2008 and up to 2011. So that, I think, is one point. And the second thing, I don't buy this argument of dependence of states has increased because this tax is now levied by consensus between union and states. I would say dependence is a function of whether the states get the money on time in an assigned manner, that it's not arbitrary. And second, they have the freedom to choose what they do with that money, right? So it doesn't matter if that money comes via the union government through the GST, but if the states have the freedom to actually do whatever they have with money, they can choose a lot of things. They have that much autonomy and independence. So in this case, if the GST were to lead to a situation where the states actually get more money and that money is untied in the sense it comes through the finance commission route, etc., and there is no conditions on where this money is, I would say the freedom of the states would have increased, not decreased.
No, so Pranay, what the argument here is that since you have states which are smaller, now the number of ways by which they can possibly raise taxes is limited as compared to a state which is larger. I mean, the geography that you have, and some of the goods have been kept outside the ambit of GST, right? For example, petroleum products and other things, right? So maybe a smaller state might be at a disadvantage in this regard. So that's what is the argument given here. The larger states might have a greater probability of having these resources which are outside the ambit of GST. And
but that again, it's not as if the smaller states their entire pool is low because they are small, and some of them are on the borders, their taxable capacity is low. So it's not as if in the pre-GST era, they were able to raise massive amount of taxes for the same reasons, right? And I think we have to also keep this in mind that the major element of all this taxation is finally the citizen, right? So this whole idea of every state having its own taxation and its own, entry barriers for goods to come in is a massive cost on us citizens, right? So it's not just a debate between union and states, and there are many times articles see this as a zero-sum contest between union and finally union and state governments are for the citizens, and we have to evaluate which situation benefits Indian citizens, right? From that perspective, I think it's not that big an issue that there is a consensus and collective mechanism through which taxes are being levied and not through the state's whims, right? And of course, like you said, there are other revenues still which are open with the states, non-tax revenues which you have written about. There are also agricultural income tax which the states are not exploiting even now, right? So anyway, so that was about this whole idea of thinking through it from the lens of dependence or independence. But now going ahead about the GST Council itself, what do you think will be the impact of this judgment?
Yeah, so see, this judgment, as we just discussed a couple of minutes back, it's not stating something which is different, right? It is stating something which was kind of obvious, just that it has now reiterated
Yeah.
that, right? So it is mentioning that, okay, the states also are at par with the union. See, if you look at the extreme or the corner case thing, right, it might so happen that the states, they decide that, okay, they're not part of it, or they will decide their own rates. That can be the extreme situation where each individual states now they decide that, okay, whatever the council is deciding, we'll not go for that, and our legislature will decide that. But that might not necessarily happen, because again, if you look at the history, right, mostly we have had whatever rulings or on the basis of consensus. So that can be the case. Also, what it is definitely going to do is the states now will be having greater bargaining powers, or at least they had it, but now it is, since it is explicit, right, they will have more bargaining powers. And the issue that you might have here is maybe the union wants to push something. In that case, they have to again buy in the states, right? So maybe some other consensus somewhere. And given that in case of India, we don't have a lot of these intergovernmental bargaining forums or institutions, it might become slightly difficult. Also, maybe we have to, or at least this council has to think of ways by which incentives are created so that the states are on board with most of these things. If the states are on, I mean, again, how do they do it? I'm not sure about it. But if there is a way by which the states are incentivized, right? They see that there is a gain if they're part of the, I mean, they agree to the same, whatever conclusion they have come up with. In that case, they will be on board. So devising those things, which is mutually advantageous for both the union and the states, might be one of the way ahead.
Yeah. So I guess one thing is there have been instances of breach of trust because of the whole compensation cess issue, where the union government said, because of the pandemic, there is a force majeure clause that might apply. And, hence the compensation which was guaranteed earlier, we might go back on it. Such situations have led to, states being more circumspect about making certain concessions from their side, right?
Yeah.
So that breach of trust is a problem which which is leading to these situations. But I guess in 1990s and 2000, like we used to talk about coalition dharma. Similarly, there's a cooperative federalism dharma also, right? So if you're going to take decisions via consensus, there will be a need to balance each other's interests, also ensure that the states don't get a feeling that they are, being taken for a ride or they are losing out massively. Otherwise, what this decision just does is that it has clarified that yes, states are at a freedom to not agree to GST council rate. So some states at the extreme might actually choose a completely different path, which will be a loss to India and to all citizens and to the people in that state as well. So that's where we wouldn't want the situation to go. So Sarthak, what will be the solutions that we don't reach that pathway? What are the broad pathways that you think we should be thinking about?
One of the things that we can think of is, like, it's a long-term thing, by the way, is you need to have, one of the reasons why you have had these conflicts in the recent times is because you don't have enough money and it leads to disputes between the union and the states. But if you are able to have higher revenues, in that case, and the states are also doing well, right? States' revenue sources or the way states can leverage their revenues, it increases. Then again, these kind of disputes issues might be reduced. Again, for that, you have to have reforms when it comes to tax administration, all the different kinds of exemptions that are there, right? Maybe we have to make it more efficient, reduce the number of exemptions, maybe the use of technology and all these things can also be leveraged. So over a period of time, how do you improve the tax administration? And also you have to focus on increasing the tax base, not think of tax rates, because it goes against increasing tax base. So these can be long-term things which can possibly help mitigate some of these issues that we see.
Right. Yeah. So finally, what you're saying is there is an issue because the size of the pie is smaller, and because the size of the pie is smaller, every state then compares what the other state is getting and why am I not getting and why is the union government taking, etc. So probably the way these issues will get settled is if the growth is back on track, and then the states then can see the benefit on their own, where the collections and the money that they're getting from this is much more than they were used to in the past.
Yeah.
So that is one sort of a Mahatma grade solution, right? You need that. Economic growth can solve a lot of these issues. But also, I would say in the short and medium term, the point that you said about technology, that could help, right? Because we clearly know that there are lots of people who should be paying taxes who aren't paying taxes. And so if the base can be widened through better use of technology, like there was a talk of linkages between the direct tax data and the indirect tax data, right? So Central Board of Direct Taxes and Central Board of Indirect Taxes. So for example, if there is a sharing of data between both of these, then there will be more ways to catch tax evasion, right? There are lots of only 3-5% of the people even file income taxes, but large number of people pay GST. So if you match the data between these two, you will be probably able to get more money from the current infrastructure itself. And I think both the boards have already started work on that. At least a year and a half ago, there was a news on more collaboration on that front. So I think that technological solution might aid to an extent to increase the tax base sooner.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I mean, if we want to sustain it, then we need economic growth to be back on track, right? Any other points you have to add?
Again, this is also related to GST, how you can leverage GST. So one thing is, maybe at this point, we also need to understand what are some of the pain points right now. And for that, we need to have more research, more development along those lines. So I was reading Dr. Rao's recent book, and where he talks about how...
Sarthak is, by the way, referring to Dr. Govind Rao's recent book, Studies in Indian Public Finance.
Yeah. So he has mentioned how there's not enough research in these areas. Usually all these policies are decided by bureaucrats. You don't have independent researchers. And one of the challenge you face here is you don't have publicly available data. In fact, when the CAG was auditing, so they also did not have enough data. And that's something he has pointed out in the book, right? So maybe access to this data, maybe having more people who are experts in these areas, right? Who decide possibly what should be the tax rates, right? How many slabs should be there? At present, by the way, there are multiple slabs, which people have mentioned, experts have mentioned that we have to reduce it. Also, what are things which should be exempting? We should be possibly reducing the number of goods and services which are under the exempt list. So all these things can come if you have enough research, right? And again, for that, you need to have more data, right? So again, something like this, if there is more transparency, there is more data available, if you have more experts who are aiding the GST Council, maybe things will be better.
All right. Thanks, Sarthak. So we got a good understanding of the recent Supreme Court judgment and a few pathways forward. So we'll end this episode here. Thanks all for listening. And if you have any thoughts on the GST Council and the recent judgment, please write to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranay.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
हम महिलाएं रोज के कामों में बहुत व्यस्त रहती हैं और हो भी क्यों ना, काम, पढ़ाई और जिम्मेदारियां सभी पूरी करनी जरूरी हैं। पर इन सब के बीच हम जीवन के एक बहुत ही जरूरी पहलू को नजरअंदाज कर देती हैं, फाइनेंस। इसीलिए हम आपके लिए लेकर आए हैं SBI लाइफ प्रस्तुत एक चुस्की फाइनेंस, महिलाओं द्वारा महिलाओं के लिए बनाया गया पॉडकास्ट। यहाँ मैं प्रियंका आचार्य, आपकी होस्ट, आपके साथ शेयर करूंगी कि किस तरह आप अपने फाइनेंसेस को बहुत आसानी से संभाल सकती हैं और फाइनेंशियली इंडिपेंडेंट बन सकती हैं। अपने 14 वर्षों का अनुभव लिए मैं आ रही हूँ हिंदी और अन्य 7 भाषाओं में हर मंगलवार नए एपिसोड्स के साथ IVM पॉडकास्ट नेटवर्क और अन्य चर्चित पॉडकास्ट प्लेटफॉर्म्स पर।